We know that heart disease is the #1 killer of all women, and in fact, it is greater than all cancers combined, including breast, including lung. Add them together, and you have more deaths from heart disease. We've thought that heart disease happens about 10 years after menopause, and that's when the risk is the greatest. But in fact, statistics have shown that in women less than 55 years old, there is an increased incidence in heart disease. Now that's something that made me write this book. Heart disease in women less than 55 years old, that we would usually think of being a low-risk population. So we have to change our ideas about heart disease, and we'll talk about this a lot more. One of the issues is awareness. As I said, women don't know that it is their greatest risk, and those groups that are at the most risk are the least aware of their risk. The American Heart Association has a 2020 strategic goal to improve the cardiovascular health of all Americans by 20% while reducing the deaths from cardiovascular disease and stroke by 20%. If we do not deal with an awareness and we do not sort of bridge that disconnect, we're in trouble. The reality is the state of our nation is getting to be a sicker and sicker country. About 45% of the country has at least one risk factor, 13% have 2 risk factors, 3% 3 risk factors, and 15% of adults have one or more of these conditions and it has not been diagnosed. When we look at the country, we see clusters of where heart disease exists. One of the greatest places is in the southeast part of the country. I always say this is where they invented deep fried turkey. How could it not be the greatest place to have heart disease? For so many different reasons, the way people live, the access to healthcare, the information, the education, the empowerment, that's what makes a difference. And that's why Go Red began. Physicians, OBGYNs and primary care physicians who are on the forefront of taking care of women incorporate these trials about prevention less than about 30 to 50% of the time. So for every male patient who comes in, there's an understanding of how to risk stratify to decide if they're at risk for heart disease. And with women, it's just not used. So what is coronary artery disease? I have to go back to this whole concept of the endothelium. The endothelium is the lining of the artery. I always think of it as the lining of a pocketbook. So you know you have the outside of your pocketbook and then you have the lining. If you cut the lining, all of a sudden your lipstick, keys, wallet, gum, everything's gone and you're like fishing, can't find it, and it's between the lining and the pocketbook. That's the lining of the artery. So when there's a tear inside that lining, there's cholesterol, inflammatory cells, all these different kinds of cells go in that lining, and all of a sudden plaque develops. Well, if the lining is not damaged, there's no tear. And if there's no tear, there's no plaque formation. And if there's no plaque formation, there's no heart disease. Now, here's what's so interesting. This was a really morbid study of traumatic deaths of young people. So on the top row, they're ages 15 to 19, and the bottom row, 34. And they're men and women, and what you can see from the light color to the dark color, plaque begins at age 15. Now this study was published in 2002, before the increase in obesity, before we were starting to see high blood pressure and high cholesterol in children. If we repeated this study now, I guarantee we would see plaque developing in 10-year-olds. The reality is it does not show up for decades and decades, but it does not mean it's not happening. So when a 20-year-old in college is chain smoking with her friends, that's what we do in college. And it might be fine that day, but the damage that's done to that lining of the artery at 20 will show up later in life. And the problem is what we can't see, we don't really acknowledge. I always say, you know, with your breasts, you look down, they're in your face. You have to acknowledge it. With your heart, it's not the same. You can't see it. You don't know what's happening. There are arteries throughout the body, in the brain, in the heart, in the kidneys, the liver. If we prevent heart disease, we prevent disease throughout the body. dementia. There's something called microinfarct, vascular dementia. This is something that develops because of the arteries. So if we deal with the arteries, we're going to deal with disease throughout the body. I think the heart is the center of our universes. And if we really pay attention to the heart, we got everything covered. With women and heart disease, it's so frustrating because not only do women not know about it, doctors don't know about it, but our arteries are very weird. Instead of there being one area where there's disease, men get it in one location. So here's the artery and it's in the middle. Women get it throughout the artery. Now, why is that important? If you do a stress test, go on a treadmill and run and pictures are taken, it compares normal to abnormal. With men, there's one area of abnormal, so when you compare it to a normal, you see there's a problem. With women, the whole artery is abnormal, so there's no place of normal to compare it to. So stress tests, which are the gold standard, don't often diagnose heart disease. So in my practice, I sit here and all of a sudden all these women are coming in, I have chest pain, but I had a normal stress test. My doctor said I'm fine and that I'm crazy or I'm anxious. And that started happening over and over and over. And that's kind of how this book happened. Because all of a sudden I'm seeing women younger and younger, sicker and sicker, and not diagnosed. We also know that stress tests are abnormal when the blockage is 70%. If you have a blockage that's 30, 40, 50, 60%, you're gonna have a normal stress test. But here's what's so scary. Heart attacks happen at blockages less than 50%. So even if you do get on a treadmill, remember Tim Russert, Meet the Press, who had a very, very normal stress test in April, big hotshot cardiologist in DC, he died in June. His stress test being normal meant that there was no blockage that was greater than 70%, but he must have had a blockage that was 50% or less, because these are the ones that cause rupture and cause sudden death. Women have different symptoms than men. There might be unusual fatigue, sleep disturbances, shortness of breath, flu-like symptoms, indigestion, chest pain. And what we know is that 2 weeks before a heart event, many times women do report these symptoms. And at the heart attack event, shortness of breath is very, very common. Nausea, sweating, maybe not that central chest pressure. I think of the Hollywood heart attack of a man clutching his chest, blue in the face, passing out. That's not what a woman looks like. Rosie O'Donnell had a heart attack last summer, and she wrote about it. She wrote a beautiful poem really saying, I was nauseous, my arms hurt. Like, who would think it was my heart? And so part of the issue is women need to understand that this totally looks different. This was a survey that 56% of women said they would call if they had chest pain, but only 30% said they would call 911 if they had shortness of breath. Yet, shortness of breath is the most common symptom. What's so scary is that in this trial, a couple thousand patients, the first symptom of heart disease in these women, 64% of the time, was sudden cardiac death. So when we look at women and heart disease, if we don't deal with prevention, we're gonna miss the boat. And so when I sit and do and travel and talk and go red for women and running all over in the book, it's because women need to know this one is up to them. This is not up to your doctor, and I've explained why. Diagnosis is hard, symptoms are hard, but the prevention, it's really up to you. So what are we gonna do about it? It's really about your life and the modifiable risk factors. So here's the general risk factors that we kind of traditionally talk about: age, high cholesterol, high blood pressure, obesity, sedentary lifestyle, family history, diabetes, smoking, and stress became a later risk factor. There was a trial, the InterHeart trial, showed that 9 modifiable risk factors cause 90% of heart attacks. So what does that mean? 90% of the time, heart disease is based on how you live. Because cholesterol, blood pressure, diabetes, smoking, abdominal obesity, that is dependent on how you choose to live, on your diet, on your exercise, whether you get up and walk, whether you smile, laughing, how you view the world. The reality is that we can't predict breast cancer, we can't predict colon cancer, but we can predict heart disease. So it's not so scary even though you can't see it. because 90% of the time, there's something that we can do about it. We do know that if you have a family history, it puts you at an increased risk, but that doesn't mean you're gonna get it. It is not a sentence, because 90% of the time, it's up to you. The first risk factor, diabetes, is really becoming an epidemic in this country as we get more obese, as we live less healthy lifestyles. Greater than 10% in 2001 of those dark red states had diabetes. And we know since 2002 that diabetes is a coronary artery disease risk equivalent, meaning you have diabetes, you're gonna get heart disease. Yet, 36% know they have it and are not treated. The longer that we have heart disease, diabetes, the longer you carry the disease, the more chance of death. So when we talk about obesity, 70% of our country is overweight, 30% are obese. You just go to like public places like Walt Disney World and things like that and look around. I was a spokesperson for a while for Kellogg's cereal, and it took me to Battle Creek, Michigan, which, I don't know if you know Battle Creek, Michigan. So I live in New York, I live right in the city. Bad place for diabetes and obesity. But everyone walks. Everyone walks. So it depends where you go in New York. It clusters. But here I go to Battle Creek and there's a lot of land. We don't have land like this. We don't have these huge stores. There was this huge store that was the size of 2 city blocks wide, 2 city blocks long. And instead of having carts, they had motorized scooters with baskets to put the food in, so people didn't have to walk. Now, the people there were so morbidly obese that I don't think they even could have walked through the grocery store to pick up the potato chips, the soda. I was absolutely out of my mind running through the store saying, take that out, why are you buying this? And I thought, this is it, my job's over, because it was so disturbing. Now, here's the flip side to it. The choices that are in these supermarkets are also potato chips and soda. So I was on the show, The Doctors, many years ago, and I was talking about chest pain. And this woman in the Bronx saw me on the show and tracked me down and came to me as a patient. And she was so motivated. She wanted to lose weight and get healthy. And I said, all right, let's do this together. 3 months later, she comes in and she gained about 10 pounds. And I thought, fabulous, this is great success. How guilty do I feel? And I kept saying to her, well, what are you doing? And she ended up taking pictures of the labels of what she was doing. She took pictures of the food. So everything that was whole wheat was fortified. There was nothing that was whole wheat. It had fructose, high fructose corn syrup. The food was not healthy. The vegetables were a day old. This is the food deserts in this country where we cannot all get healthy food. Are you aware of this? This is something that has really come to my attention recently, where people are the most unhealthy, they can't get the healthiest food. And so when we look at obesity in this country, part of it is because of what we are providing people. We know that 30% are considered obese, 30% of our country. And this started again in 1985, and we see people getting heavier and heavier, so that in 2008, 30% of those states that are in the darker colors were considered obese. It's based on the body mass index. You can find this chart anywhere. I'll give you an extra second to look at it. Height and weight on the bottom. And we know that children who are obese when they are young are going to become obese when they become older. So a child who has one parent that is obese has a 72% chance of becoming obese himself. Or 2 parents, there's an 87% chance. So when we talk about family history, it's not just the genetics, it's how you choose to live. So in families that eat meat and potatoes and are heavy, the family's heavy because that's what they're eating. We know that high blood pressure goes up with body mass index and that diabetes goes up with body mass index. And we know that belly fat is associated with diabetes. I can't seem to lose weight, doctor. I've tried everything short of diet and exercise. Does digestion count as exercise? That one makes me laugh all the time. The metabolic syndrome is really about this belly fat. And it's kind of how we've evolved, I have to say. It's belly fat with elevated triglycerides, low HDL, the good cholesterol, sort of borderline elevated blood pressure, and elevated sugars. It's not diabetes, it's right before diabetes. But we know that it's associated with heart disease and clotting and inflammation and all of these lipid abnormalities. What's so interesting, polycystic ovarian disease in young women, women who can't get pregnant, who have cysts on their ovaries, they have lipid abnormalities, they have insulin resistance, a little bit of extra belly fat. I have one patient who came in who couldn't get pregnant, and she had high triglycerides and low HDL, good cholesterol, and we kind of changed around her diet, changed around her lifestyle, and she ended up getting pregnant because she had polycystic ovarian disease and the metabolic syndrome. And our big joke was, my cardiologist got me pregnant. You know, it was bizarre. But there is a combination of these endocrinologic, metabolic things. If we don't menstruate normally, there's something wrong. If we are not able to get pregnant, there's something wrong with the system, not with that one area. And I think part of what we need to understand as women, we are a whole being, not just our ovaries and our breasts and our heart being separate. At age 60, about 40% of women have the metabolic syndrome. High blood pressure, we are now calling 130/85 pre-hypertensive, and it's worth paying attention to. Medications at 140/90 or above. And for people who have multiple risk factors, we really want to keep that blood pressure less than 130/85. 65 million Americans starting at age 6 have high blood pressure, and 1 in 3 adults have it and don't know they have it. And that's why it's called the silent killer. At age 60, 50% of people will have high blood pressure, and as I say, which side of the fence are you going to be on? My whole comment is train for menopause like you're training for the marathon, because if you don't, you're going to end up with high blood pressure. Those women that have high blood pressure during pregnancy, not preeclampsia, but borderline high blood pressure, end up with the risk of heart disease later in life. And we saw these in a test called a calcium score, looking for plaque in the arteries. So for women in their 20s and 30s who do have high blood pressure, these are women who are at risk. Again, a woman being a whole being and looking at her throughout her life is important in determining who's at risk for heart disease. One of the ways that we can deal with high blood pressure is reducing sodium in the diet, and a 10% reduction of sodium per day prevents 28,000 deaths and $7 billion in healthcare. And look at these food groups. This is where most of our sodium is. It's in cold cuts and breads and cured meat, pizza, poultry, soup, sandwiches, cheese. I think it's everything that we really crave right before we get our periods. You know, think about that. But if you cut back on salt, it really does actually matter. About 2,300 milligrams per day is what's recommended. Cholesterol, there is so much controversy that it actually makes me crazy. People are like, it doesn't matter, statins are bad for you. The reality is, if you have high cholesterol, whether it be LDL, L, I say the lousy, the lower the better, or high triglycerides, which is associated with carbohydrates and sugar, those lead to heart disease. We want the HDL, the happy, the higher the better, cholesterol to be as high as possible. As the LDL goes up, the risk of heart disease goes up. And for every 1% decrease in LDL, there is a 1% reduction in heart disease. For every 1% increase in HDL, there's a reduction in heart disease by 3%. So this HDL is the most protective kind. And guess what increases HDL? Exercise. So it's up to you. It's part of your lifestyle choice. As the triglycerides go up, again, carbohydrates, sugars in the diet, your risk of heart disease goes up. And the most common risk factor that we see in women newly diagnosed with risk factors are problems with the cholesterol. So we say know your numbers, know what your cholesterol is, your blood pressure is, because if you don't know, you can't do anything about it. So it's really important to know what your numbers are. Smoking, I just say, number one reason for people dying, number one reason To stop smoking is every reason. There's no such thing as a social smoker. You smoke a couple cigarettes, it increases your risk, and the second you stop smoking, your risk goes down. Those younger women who are on birth control pills and are smoking, their risk for heart attack goes up exponentially. So let's go back in history. When we talk about women and heart disease again, it's based on the Framingham risk analysis, which started in 1948 in a little town in Framingham, Massachusetts, when the women stayed home and the men went to work and they looked at their lives. So they found out that those people who were at risk were men who were working, who were smoking, who were eating meat, and who weren't exercising. But that's not the reality of our lives today. Age, total cholesterol, HDL, smoking, and blood pressure was it. But when we looked at women, about 20% were missed when looking at this old paradigm. So a new analysis of greater than 24,000 women were established, and we looked at things like inflammation, family history, blood sugars, and that actually risk stratified women to see who was at risk for heart disease with this new paradigm. But what was not included was stress, was work, was the balancing act between taking care of our children, our families, our parents. Women are doing everything, and until there's an understanding that this doing everything will take its toll on the heart, we're not going to be able to prevent this disease. A calcium score is a screening test. It looks for calcification in the artery, which is associated with plaque. So young women who have a family history of heart disease, I recommend that they get a calcium score. What I talk about are heartthrobs, not just the risk factors, but beyond the risk factors. And that's really about your life, what's going on right now. Heart disease takes time to develop, so right now is the time to prevent it. Looking at your heartthrobs is really about your vitality, your heart, your mind, your stress, how you view life, and what your risks are based on your own life is how we will and should determine heart disease in the future. So I kind of rewrote the risk factors into my own heartthrobs based on what I've seen. It's an exercise tolerance. So if someone cannot walk up a flight of stairs, we know by multiple trials that you're at an increased risk of heart disease. Your exercise tolerance is how much you can do. Can you run around? Can you go up and down the stairs, carry packages, grab your bags, talk on the phone? What your ability to multitask and exercise plays a role into whether or not you're going to develop heart disease. Your resting heart rate, when you check your pulse and it's very fast, that increases your risk of heart disease, even if it's above 70. So a low resting heart rate is important. Heart rate variability, it depends on whether you live in the fight or flight mode or whether you live in the rest and digest mode. There's the nervous system in our bodies which tell us which one takes over. The sympathetic nervous system, the fight or flight, which is constantly running and fighting and doing. Many of us live that way. And if you do, your heart rate's going to be high. And if your heart rate's high, that increases your risk of heart disease. How we counteract that? Breathing, exercise, meditation, laughing, all of those other things. Smoking, cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar, inflammation. ApoE, it tells us how we metabolize food. Some people are actually born unable to metabolize fats. And those are families who've had heart disease very young. A lot of the young people have had heart disease, living on meats, living on fats. And it's actually a genetic marker that tells us how we metabolize foods. For many of these people, I say, you gotta be a vegetarian. That's the safest way to live. Hormonal issues, family history, your body mass index, vegetable and fruit consumption, your drinking, sleep, stress, and life perceptions. The first thing that I say is that exercise is the best medication. It does everything from decreasing your blood pressure, decreasing your heart rate, your cholesterol, keeping your weight off, but it actually makes you feel good. And nonetheless, many of us, greater than 60% of us, don't do anything. This is a recent trial that I think is unbelievable. For every hour spent in front of the television, there is an 18% increased risk of cardiovascular disease. So when you get home at night, the first thing that we all want to do, trust me, I feel the same way, is to sit on the couch and watch something. just don't do it. I mean, go do it after you exercise or start moving around. I love that show, The Voice, and it's on for like 2 hours, and I'm sitting there marching, because you know if you don't purposely and deliberately move and exercise, you're at an increased risk. For every hour a day spent just walking, and this is 1 hour a day, there's a decreased risk in diabetes and obesity. So I'm not saying you have to go to the gym and go crazy, but you have to do something. For those of us who do exercise more vigorously, there is a decrease in the relative risk of coronary artery disease. And for those of us who are the fittest, the death rate decreases. So exercise is your best friend. 150 minutes per week, that's 30 minutes 5 days a week of moderate intensity exercise. And if you're not going to do that, then at least walk. And if you walk, then it's every single day and about an hour a day. What exercise does is increase that happy good cholesterol and reduces heart disease by 7.6% in women. It is the most powerful thing we can do for ourselves. And again, it's 150 minutes per week or 10,000 steps a day. I just recently was given this thing, Jawbone Up. There's Fitbits and all these different kind of things to wear, to put on. It's so cool. It tells you how many steps you take a day. And it's been really very helpful for me to be accountable and aware. And I think if we're not accountable and not aware, we have no idea what we're doing. And so part of changing behavior is really having an understanding of what you need to change and where you need to change it. People always say, how do I lose weight? It's like, first of all, you have to know what you're eating. And until you know that, you don't know. Prescription for prevention, Hippocrates, the father of medicine, said nearly 2,400 years ago, if we could get every individual the right amount of nourishment and exercise, not too little and not too much, we would have found the safest way to health. We have not come very far, have we? The Western diet increases the risk of heart disease by 30%. That's like a hamburger and a diet soda in this country at this point. You know, you have a diet soda, so you forgive yourself for eating the hamburger, but it actually really increases our risk of heart disease. There's been a huge increased consumption in carbohydrates and simple sugars, and that red bar on the right is showing that sugar-sweetened beverages have increased exponentially. In New York, the big fight was about 64-ounce colas. This is what we're talking about, that sugar-sweetened beverages increasing triglycerides, increasing belly fat, leading to metabolic syndrome, leading to heart disease. I was speaking and someone in the audience said, well, what do you think about it? Don't you think that Bloomberg is being a dictator? And I said, I don't know, he kind of started the conversation. And if you don't have the conversation, then you don't have an awareness. And if you don't have the awareness, nothing changes. And people living in regions with greater than 33 fast food chains have a 13% greater odds of stroke. Is that unbelievable? So it's what is in front of your face. That's what we do because life is busy. So you have to pay attention and be aware. If you're late for work, you're just going to go to the drive-thru and get what's ever there. And unless you understand that, it increases your risk. That's what happens in life. So these are some familiar common fast food places. I used to badmouth McDonald's all the time, and now, compared to this, it's almost like a fast food snack, a healthy snack, because look how less calories, this is what people are eating. In 2007, there was the Face the Fat campaign, which talked to people about healthy fats, omega-3 fatty acids, canola oil, olive oil, flaxseed oil. And what they found out was that when people went out to eat, all of a sudden that switch went off in their brains. So they would ask, are you concerned at all with the amount of fats in food? 2006 on the bottom, 2007 on the top. Are you concerned about the amounts of fat? And after being educated, people became more concerned. Are you concerned about the types of fat? And after being educated, people became more concerned. But then they would go out to dinner. And on the left side, that green is never. Would you ask the server about the types of oil or fat? Never, no matter how educated. Would you request ingredients? Never, no matter how educated. Would you ask the server to suggest a different meal option? Never. Would you order a healthy choice on the menu? Never. So it's almost like at home, you're going to be healthy, but then when you go out to eat, doesn't matter anymore. And in the orange, guess what? More people are eating out more and more. So we are in big trouble. We know that omega-3s are found in canola oil, olive oil, flaxseed oil. We look for omega-3s and omega-6s as being the healthiest and saturated fats being the least healthy. And that's what I recommend in a diet. Fish that are fatty cold water fish, mackerel, salmon, herring, trout, sardines, these are the best fish to eat, and that's 2 servings per week. Omega-3 fatty acids decrease triglycerides, they decrease LDL, increase HDL, really kind of like a wonder part of the food. There's a lot of information about supplementation and whether or not to take them. In men, we're not so sure, but in women, they have not been shown to be detrimental. Everything you can get from your food is better than getting it from a supplement, though. We know that fibers and something called stanol esters, which is on the outside of nuts, decrease LDL cholesterol. That's why nuts are so healthy. This is why whole grains are so healthy. And on the left is the old USDA pyramid. On the right is the Mediterranean diet filled with multigrains, bread, couscous, polenta grains, fruits, vegetables, beans, legumes, olive oil, and the meat is the smallest portion. And the Mediterranean diet showed to reduce the incidence of heart disease by 72%. So when I talk about the healthiest diet, that's really what I talk about with my patients. And this is what the USDA has come up with now, which is really that fruits and vegetables should be the majority of the plate. There are multiple diets out there: Ornish, Pritikin, Sugar Buster, Zone, Atkins, Weight Watchers, South Beach. Guess what? They all work if you can stay on it. But it's all about compliance. If you can go on a diet, I think you can go off of the diet. So I never talk about diets because I never want people to go off of diets. I talk about choices and lifestyle. And so instead of having butter or margarine, you have a little bit of olive oil. Instead of cream sauces, you have tomato sauces. And when you understand and become accountable for what you're doing, then you know how to change and what choices you can make to eat healthier. If you know how many calories you're eating, or if you know that there's 350 calories in that muffin you decided to have for breakfast and you take that away, that's 3 pounds in a month. What's that? 5 minutes. 5 minutes?
Like 5
Thank you.
Sorry.
That's okay. 3 pounds in a month, and that's 40 pounds in a year. So the American Heart Association said there's 7 components, 4 behaviors, and 3 factors. And if you do these things, then there's a lower risk of all-cause death from cardiovascular disease. On mylifecheck.org, which is the American Heart Association website, you can find out what your risk is based on my Life Simple 7. But let's go back to the lifestyle. Let's go back to how we're living. Sleep is crucial, 7.5 hours per night. Every time I say this, I laugh because it's not my strong point. But we know that there is a connection between stress and depression, and that home or work stress is the most common problem that women have. But when we have stress and depression, it often sounds like this: shortness of breath, dizziness, lightheaded, chest pain, nausea. It's kind of like having a heart attack. And for those of us who are living on that stress level, it's affecting our hearts. In one study of 12,000 nurses, high pressure at work increased the incidence of heart disease by 35%. This work thing, we've got to figure it out. We've got to figure out the balance. We've got to figure out what to do, because it is affecting our hearts. Depression is a huge risk factor for heart disease, especially in women. And we know that it peaks young and comes back later in life during perimenopause and menopause. I'm going to show you several pictures. They're going to go very, very quickly. So look at the faces. Who looked at happy faces? Who looked at sad faces? I'm not going to get it. It turns out, as we get older, we tend to be drawn towards sad faces. That little babies, when you coo and giggle and are drawn to happy, as we get older, we actually are more drawn to the sad. So if we pay attention, if we know them, and we fight against the tendency to become pessimistic as we age, it'll help. It makes a difference. Because depression is twice as common in women than in men, and it really is a strong risk factor. I talk about the 4 S's: stress, sex, sleep, and supplements or nutrition. That combating stress by simple things, by breathing, by laughing, by exercising. Tend and be friend. Find your group of friends that you can talk to. Put away the buts. I will do that, but this might happen, but put away the buts and just do it. Find out a way. Understand what you need, your self-nurturing rituals. And I always say, find the theme song. Whatever song resonates with you that helps. It's like having the soundtrack of your life in the background. Because as you sing that little song to yourself, it forces you to breathe. And as you breathe, your heart rate goes down, your blood pressure goes down, and the stress response is stopped right in its tracks. Remember Whitney Houston's song, The Greatest Love of All? Sometimes if I'm going to a very stressful situation, I'll be like, and everyone thinks, oh, she's so happy. I'm like, try to adjust your attitude. It's really about looking at things glass half full rather than half empty. I'm talking about this all day. I got stuck in the airport last night for 3 hours. There was a delay in the flight. And the guy next to me, he's like, oh my God, are you so mad? And I was like, not really. What are you going to do? What could you do? You get stuck in traffic? Sing, breathe. Life is good. It's all about your perception. Sex, believe it or not, it's something that has not been talked about. And then the American Heart Association comes out with a statement. Sexual activity is important for quality of life. I was like, wow, that was bold. Shock. But we know that when people do have a problem with sex, there's usually other issues, whether it's physical, emotional, but it's part of life and it's part of who we are, and it matters. It matters. This was another thing that I love. With women, they don't feel like it. You know, they rather, there's talking that comes first and then sex, and men are like, we'll talk later. You know, it's just the disconnect. But a study showed that once you do it, you're happy that you did it. I don't know who did that study, probably some guy. Anyway. The Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index said this: when you don't sleep, your risk of depression and anxiety goes up. And your leptin levels, your idea in your brain that you are full and you don't want to eat, goes down. So there's more obesity and inflammation and all these other things. So sleep is so important. And last, find a purpose. Life is really about family, love, health, and work. And if you work with a purpose, it's part of the passion of living. When we talk about stress in the workplace, if you have a passion, if you have an understanding that you come first, that you need to be the one driving your own health, that this concept of women and heart disease and living from the heart, being the healthiest we can be, comes from us, then we are more likely to become as healthy as we can be, not just in our hearts, but in our choices for health, whether it be how we eat, how we exercise, how we choose to view the world. But it has to start somewhere, and it first has to begin with becoming accountable and understanding who we are and what we need. The last topic of the 4S is supplements. One of the things that we found out is vitamin D is very important, and that low vitamin D is associated with high blood pressure and is something worth getting checked by your doctor, because most women today are vitamin D deficient. So I wrote a heart book, my Dr. Suzanne Steinbaum's heart book, and I wrote it like this because I'm telling all of you that it becomes important for you to write your own heart book to make yourself accountable. 10 things you're happy about in your own life, 10 things you're happy about in yourself, 10 things you're happy about in your job, and then 10 things that you want to change your life, and that's where you begin. So when someone says to me, I want to lose weight, I'm like, well, how are we going to do this? I'm going to go on a diet. Well, what kind of diet? Because the second you go on a diet, at some point you're going to come off the diet. I'm going to go exercise. I'm going to wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning and I'm going to exercise. Well, are you a morning person? Not really. Well, that's going to last 2 days. You know, unless you really know who you are, becoming healthy, making the right lifestyle choices, it's not going to happen. And it starts with accountability, writing your heart book, knowing your risk factors, knowing your heart throbs. And I always say, if you live from your heart and not from your head, that's really where health begins. Martin Luther King said, the quality, not the longevity of one's life is what is important. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, it's only when we truly know and understand that we have limited time on earth and that we have no way of knowing when our time is up, that we will begin to live each day to the fullest, as if it was the only one that we had. And that's my son and me. Living from the heart is really about live truthfully, authentically, and honestly, drawing strength and consolation from work, family, love, and health. Cultivate and nurture those things not from your head, where logic always rules, but from your heart, where you can feel what is right and real for you. Live that way, and chances are things are going to be just fine. Thank you so much.